Good afternoon. It's Mrs. Woodbury, Julie Woodbury from Woodbury Farm, and today I'm going to invite you into my tomato garden. I have about 45 plants of tomatoes here. There are a couple that aren't doing very well, and I'm going to take a quick peek at those. I have two main things that I'd like to talk to you about. The first one is the difference between determinate tomatoes and indeterminate tomatoes. So these tomatoes here on these stakes are indeterminate tomatoes. They keep growing and growing and setting fruit as they grow. So you'll notice that they have a number of flowers at the very tops of the vines. You'll notice that I have them tied to very tall poles. I wouldn't have to have the poles quite that high, but that's what we had. And I keep tying them up with these green twist ties, basically, as they grow. And I just keep, just tying them up again and again. So these tomatoes, you can see, have clusters of fruit down on the bottoms. There is a very nice cluster of fruit right there. That is a red cherry. And right over here, it's a little harder to see these, but in there is some, I forgot the name now, sun gold. A nice kind of orangish yellow cherry tomato. There's another cluster over there. And these will continue to develop clusters. You can see another cluster. More clusters right here as it's growing up. These are smaller and less mature, and it's going to keep doing that for as long as the season is reasonable. So here in North Dakota, it'll quit setting fruit probably fairly soon here because we're starting to be done with the season. The days are going to start to get shorter. It's going to freeze, and as soon as they freeze, they will definitely stop setting fruit. The second type of tomato is indeterminate tomatoes. Indeterminate tomatoes are more like this kind right here. And most of the time, these tomatoes grow to a certain size and then they stop growing. They're usually much more compact, although sometimes they're also fairly large. They grow to a certain size and then they stop, and they usually put all of their power into producing fruit in a short amount of time. So you can see there are still a few flowers on here, but really most of the fruit is already forming, and in some cases even starting to ripen. I don't have any ripe larger tomatoes yet, but we're getting there. A couple weeks maybe. So the second thing I want to talk about is related. In my garden, I have 3 types of tomato supports. I'm trying to back up and get through the vines as we talk here. I have 3 different kinds of tomato supports. Over here, I have stakes. Those stakes have a good sturdy fence post pounded into the ground, and then a piece of conduit dropped on, and I tie the tomatoes to them. This middle one, I just have the tomatoes supported by some tires, and that is enough to just kind of keep them from sprawling on the ground. It keeps them up, a little bit so that they're not laying in, in mud or whatever, getting stepped on, those kinds of things. And as you can see, for that size of tomato, that's working quite well. My third type that I have over here is tomato cages. These work for a tomato that's a little more in between. This is a very tall tomato cage, and it works fairly well. This guy right here, this one here, he should be in here, inside there. But if I try and pull him in now, I might break it, so I'm not going to try and do that. And so this kind of cage right here will probably work for an indeterminate tomato or a determinate tomato. This kind over here is really only good for an indeterminate tomato because they're really quite short. While we're at it, let's look at these tomatoes that are forming here. Look at those. Those are Cherokee Purple. I can tell that they're Cherokee Purple partly because of their size, also because that was the label. but also because of this darker green streaking right here. A lot of the big tomatoes that I have don't have that dark green streak. And if you look at that compared to the size of my hand, you can see how big that tomato is. So, to review, 2 kinds of tomatoes. Determinate grows to a certain size and then stops. Indeterminate keeps growing throughout the season. If your season lasts from April to December, they'll keep growing and keep producing tomatoes the whole time. And then different types of tying or caging systems. There are also several other kinds that I've kind of tried and rejected or determined that they would be too much work. The last thing I want to point out to you is the mulch that is between the rows and, as you can see, under the cage and inside the tire. In this case, it's just a straw. You can use wood chip mulch, but it's a little hard to work with. You can use plastic mulch. You can use newspaper. There's many kinds of things. This is doing 2 things for this garden. Number 1, it is helping to suppress weeds. That doesn't mean there are no weeds, as you can see. It means there are less weeds and the weeds will be easier to pull. These rows, the tomatoes and the beans here, were weeded at the same time. And you can see there's a random, they were weeded at the same time and then the straw mulch was put down. And you can see in the tomato rows, there's a random weed here and there, whereas in the beans, there are quite a few of them that have managed to take back hold since I last weeded both of them. So, a few things from my tomato garden. And we'll see you again next time.